A junior, biochemistry major.
Okay, good. And have you been here all 3 years? Or, I mean, at the U?
I've been at the U all 3 years.
Yeah.
I just found out about Canterbury this year.
Oh, did you now? Oh. Where is your home? Is it Seattle here or?
Yeah, it's Redmond.
Where?
Redmond?
Oh, over the other side, yeah. Very good. All right there, friend. How are we doing?
Pretty good.
Okay.
What were you doing?
I was helping at a company called Safeco, and they had a two-day
big office.
they had a 2-day assignment for me.
We're ready.
You ready?
You can go.
No.
Alicia, you going to sit down or you going to?
I'm going to sit down.
All
I'm
right.
going to be the gatekeeper, but
No, I'll be
All right.
Claire's ready.
Well, as some of you may know, the #1 book on the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list this week is Tom Brokaw's The Greatest Generation. The story of the 13 million American men and women who grew up during the Depression and who fought and won World War II. I'm one of the 13 million. And Mary asked me to share with you tonight my spiritual journey as a medic in World War II. Well, to begin with, that experience did indeed ultimately move me to seek holy orders, to go into the ordained ministry, but I actually had 2 other ways I could have gone. But before I get into that, well, let me tell you what they are, then I'll go into some background material. I could have gone into show business, or I could have gone into teaching. But first now, let me give you some background material about Bob Cochrane. I'm a cradle Episcopalian, the eldest of 3 children. My mother and father were cradle Episcopalians. We go back a long, long way. My mother's background is French, Huguenot French, and American Indian, and my father's is English and Native American. So church was a normal part of our life. All 5 of us, Mom, Dad, and my brother and sister and I, went to church every single Sunday. Some of you may remember the perfect attendance pins that you'd get when you went to Sunday school. I mean, I had them down to my knees. Never missed a Sunday. I began to sing in the choir when I was 9 years old. God gifted me with a fairly decent voice in those days, not anymore, but in those days. In fact, my first public appearance, as I recall now, was when I was 5 years old, in the kindergarten, standing on a chair in PS 54, Brooklyn, New York, singing "O Little Town of Bethlehem." That was before the ACLU got involved and you couldn't do those things in school anymore. My 5th and 6th grade Sunday school teacher was a man named Sam Benson, who was, as I now think back on my years, probably next to my parents, the most influential person in my young life at that time. Sam at that time probably was no more than in his late 20s or early 30s, but I was an 11-year-old and I thought he was an old man. But he helped prepare me for confirmation. He was a deeply, deeply spiritual man. Happily married, a wonderful guy, and we had long talks together. And he was, for me at that young age, an example of what a good Episcopalian should be. And he was a man. I mean, you think of women going to church, but men sort of stayed away in droves, but not Sam. Sam was very, very active in the church, and he, for me, was a role model at that young age. So, okay, I indicated that I did a lot of singing in my young life. I did have a great musical background. The choir master of my parish in Brooklyn gave me private voice lessons in Carnegie Hall, where he had a studio. In junior high, I sang the role of Coco in Gilbert and Sullivan's Mikado. In high school, I was president of the Glee Club, and when I graduated, I was one of the original members of the Robert Shaw Chorale, and also worked out for a short time with Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians. So I had a pretty active theater background. I graduated from high school, Boys High School, Brooklyn, a school of 5,000 students, all boys. There was also a girls' high school in Brooklyn, 5,000 girls. They don't exist anymore. When I graduated from high school, I knew I wanted to go on to college, but I didn't know what I really wanted to do with my life. So I went back to Sam Benson, my mentor, my influence when I was a 12-year-old. And Sam's advice was, and I try to remember the words, he said, do what God wants you to do. And I said, Mr. Benson, how can I know what God wants me to do? Is he going to send an angel down, or is he going to have a bolt from the blue? And he said, Robert, in those days everybody called me Robert except the kids in school. Robert, he said, read your Bible. How did God reveal himself to the ancient Hebrews? How did he reveal himself to the disciples of Jesus? They looked at things that happened to them, he said, and they asked, what's God saying in all of this? Go on to college, he said, look at the things you experience there, analyze what gifts you think you have, and then ask yourself, what's God saying to me? Well, I entered Brooklyn College in September of 1941. And 3 months later, on Sunday afternoon, December the 7th, I was upstairs in my room studying for a history exam the next day. My father, my younger brother, and my uncle who lived with us were all listening to the New York Giants football game on the radio. My mother calls up to me from downstairs, Robert, where's Pearl Harbor? And I said, well, that's the big American naval base in Hawaii. He said, the Japanese just bombed it. Well, that, of course, changed the lives of many of us. 1 year later, in December of 1942, I was drafted into the Army. I was in my sophomore year in college at the time. I was sent down to the MRTC in Camp Pickett, Virginia. That stood for Medical Replacement Training Center in Blackstone, Virginia, to be trained as a medic. After basic training, 13 weeks of basic training, I earned corporal stripes and was kept on to train another bunch coming in. I didn't want to be a medic. I deeply resented it. I didn't want to be a pill pusher. I didn't want to be a bedpan commando. I really resented it. I discovered, however, that all the guys in my training company were either college graduates or had had some college. So I asked about that. How come? I asked the first sergeant. And he explained, you guys, he said, scored very high on your AGCT, your Army General Classification Test, which is sort of the equivalent of an IQ test. He said the Army needs men who can be quickly trained in highly technical subjects. So guys like you were either sent to the Signal Corps or to the medics, because you'd have to learn fast stuff that you wouldn't normally be exposed to. Well, I suppose that was supposed to make me feel good, but it really didn't. I still resented being a medic. I really wanted to be, why I don't know, but I really wanted to be in the Armored Corps, drive a tank. Later on, I discovered that was about the worst possible thing it could have been. In the summer of '43, I was sent to Camp Campbell, Kentucky, and assigned as a medic to night duty in the wax ward, the women's ward. I was the envy of all the guys. As you know, in military hospitals, the tour of duty is from 7 to 7, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., or 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. I drew the night shift. And I used to sing the girls to sleep every night. They discovered I could sing, so before we put lights out, I had to go into the ward and sing. The things I sang were all the old Frank Sinatra tunes. I was a crooner. The girls, they were wax and civilian spouses of GIs in this women's ward, and they would play tricks on me. For example, we'd have to take TPRs, temperature, pulse, and respiration, every afternoon about 4 o'clock. And the nurse in charge, I was an enlisted man, remember, I was a corporal at the time. The nurses would assign me the duty of taking the TPRs. If I was on day duty, 4 o'clock, night duty, I'd have to do it right before they went to sleep around 10 o'clock. Well, what they used to do, they would take go around, stick thermometers in their mouths, and then one of them would take the thermometer out, and there was a sink at the end of the ward, and she'd run it under hot water. So when I pulled it out, it's reading like 104. Oh my God, I go running back to the ward office to get the nurse. So we got somebody's dying out there with a 104 temperature. Anyway, it was fun. I did enjoy it. But in the summer of '43, well, while I was at Camp Campbell, working in the hospital, the Army sent me on temporary duty, TDY, up to Fort Harrison, Indiana, where I was trained for 6 weeks as a surgical and orthopedic technician. I learned how to work in the operating room as what was called a non-sterile technician, whose main job was to count sponges. You don't leave a sponge inside of the patient when you close after an operation. So I was qualified as a surgical and orthopedic technician. When I got back to Camp Campbell, I was given sergeant stripes and made part of a cadre, part of a corps of NCOs for the formation at Camp Campbell of the 110th General Hospital. We were training draftees that were coming down from the recruitment center up in Chicago. So we put together the 110th General under the command of Colonel John Berry, who used to say, "Don't worry, men, I will bring you back safely." You know, rear echelon hospital, he's going to bring us back safely. He also used to say, "Guys, keep your pecker in your pants and you won't get burned." That was another one of his favorite expressions. Anyway, if my grandchildren are going to see this, well, they understand. Well, to make a long story short, in May of 1944, the 110th sailed out of Boston Harbor for England. Curiously enough, one of the sailors on that ship, it was a troop ship, it was the old USS America, which was a luxury liner, which the Army or the government had renamed the USS West Point. And one of the sailors on that ship, and I didn't know it until he discovered that through my mother and his mother that I was on board, was my next door neighbor, a kid I'd played ping pong with and played kick the can with in the streets of New York. So Mike Collins treated me royally. I was assigned to 4H, that was hold number 4 levels below the deck. We called it Torpedo Junction, those of us who were down there in hold 4H. And of course the ship zigzagged all the way across the Atlantic to avoid any German submarines, which we never saw. Anyway, we landed in England, and again, the hospital was set up in Cheltenham, in Gloucestershire, a few miles from the county seat in Gloucester, on top of a hill overlooking the city of Cheltenham. And I was one of 2 enlisted men assigned to the orthopedic ward, since that had been my training. This was an English hospital, which the Americans got on a kind of a reverse lend-lease. And it wasn't a big 10-story building. It was a series of single-story buildings that radiated out from a central hub. That was deliberately built that way to avoid German bombs. If it had been a single building, one bomb could have wiped out the whole building. But by dividing the wards up into single corridors, so to speak, if 1 or 2 got hit, at least some of the rest would survive. So in my ward, the orthopedic ward, there were 45 beds. And in the area between my ward and the next ward, they had set up one of these big Army hospital tents which could accommodate 15 more patients. So we had a total of 60 patients to worry about. Well, we set it up, as I said, middle of May in 1944. And for about a week and a half to 2 weeks, we sort of goofed off. Nobody was there. We had no patients. We would just, we'd go down and visit the pubs in Cheltenham and just had fun. Until the night of June the 5th. And then the word came over the PA system, prepare to receive casualties. And I remember so well that night, as we began to get everything set up in the ward, the drone of aircraft overhead, constantly, all night long, light and heavy bombers going over the channel to France. Well, of course, the next day was D-Day. And within hours, we were receiving casualties from Normandy. And I guess that orthopedic ward that I was in had pretty much the worst of all the wounded, broken bodies. We had guys in that ward in full body casts. We had amputees. And these men couldn't help themselves. We worked constantly. For the first 2 weeks after D-Day, we worked 24 hours on and 12 hours off, all of us. And we popped pills. We took Benzodrine and drank black coffee to stay awake. It was hell. And the guys were in shock. You had to tend to their bodily needs. You had to bathe them. You had to feed them. Catheterizations. I had to do all of these things together with the nurses and the other 2 enlisted technicians who worked with me. I learned how to set up the traction. When the doctor sent the patient back with his leg in traction, he would say, put X number of pounds of traction on this guy. So I had to put the buckshot in the little bags and hang him up on the pulley, you know, and yet I learned to do that. They didn't teach me how to do that in the technician school. I had to learn that on the job. But, you know, for the first time, I began to feel good about being a medic. The resentment sort of disappeared when I discovered that I was helping guys who couldn't help themselves, or doing for other people what they couldn't do for themselves. And thank God we had things like penicillin, which was brand new. We had sulfa drugs. And I can remember setting up penicillin drips. And that really helped a lot. But it wasn't all work. The hospital formed a dance band, a dance combo. Let's see, there was piano, clarinet, trumpet, swing bass, guitar, and they asked me to be the vocalist. And we played every Saturday night for the officers' club dance on base in the hospital. And I was known as Bob the Singing Sergeant. And I got propositioned by at least 3 nurses also, which I never accepted because they were officers and I was not. And I didn't want any trouble with these nurses. Anyway, that was fun to do that. All those old Frank Sinatra numbers I knew, and I still remember them. In late November of 1944, I was transferred out of the hospital. Avon is calling again. Transferred out of the hospital in England to a combat zone on the continent. Why? Well, the casualties were so bad in Europe, the American casualties, that they couldn't get replacements over fast enough from the States. In those days, they all came by ship. Now, you know, they put them in these big cargo planes and fly them all over the world. But everybody had to come over by sea. They couldn't get 1A classified combat troops over fast enough. So what the Army did was to examine all first healthy rear echelon troops. Men were classified 1A. And we were sent forward, and our places were taken by wounded soldiers who were not wounded severely enough to be ZI'd, as it was called, sent back to the zone of the interior. They were reclassified as limited service. So my job was taken in the hospital, was taken by a medic who had been wounded in France, but who was not wounded severely enough to have been allowed to go home, go back to the States. So I was sent up as one classified as 1A to a forward unit. Sailed across the English Channel on an English boat, and the English didn't keep their boats very clean. I can remember we were crossing the channel, and the first meal we had wasn't all that bad. The problem was, when the time came to wash the mess kits in the big cauldrons of supposedly hot boiling water, they never changed the water. So the last thing was as soapy as the first one. That night, the whole ship came down with the GIs. I mean, well, I don't want to go into the details of that. And the English had the gall to say these Americans are so dirty. Anyway, we survived that diarrhea problem, and we landed in France. And then the next thing I know, I'm being pushed into a cattle car, into a freight car, what the French called a 40 and 8, a railroad car built to carry 40 men or 8 horses. And we were all jammed into this. Remember, this is the winter time now, and the damn thing wasn't heated. And we huddled next to each other to keep warm as we traveled across France. Well, we were discharged. I was assigned to the 90th Infantry Division. Division headquarters was at that time at Metz in France. That's when I joined the division. Assigned to the 315th Medical Battalion of the 90th Infantry Division of General Patton's 3rd Army. I joined the division, as I say, at Metz, was issued my basic combat equipment, armband, helmet with the Red Cross on it, medical pouches, all the things that I would need. Now, so far as the war was concerned, that wasn't the front line. That was quite rear echelon, I mean, for the division headquarters. But I joined that unit on December the 16th. And December the 16th was the starting date for the big German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, otherwise known as the Battle of the Bulge. Well, although the 90th, my division, had already gone into Germany and crossed the Saar River, they got pushed back. So by the time I joined them, they were stalled, the division was stalled in an area somewhere between the Moselle River on the western flank and the Saar River on the eastern flank. And there they sat, the division. The division's mission at that time was to keep the Germans from moving north to reinforce von Rundstedt in the Ardennes, where he was trying to push everybody back to the sea. So for 3 weeks, we sat there about stalled. But I learned by talking to the other guys who had been in combat some of the things I could look forward to. You know, how to dig a foxhole in the snow, how to use the morphine syrettes that were in my kit. I mean, I got training in how to use the equipment that I was given, because hospital medic is a quite different thing than a frontline medic. Well, the medical battalion was responsible for providing at least 4 degrees of medical aid in combat. I don't know if it's still that same way nowadays. That's just over 50 years ago. The most forward unit was the company aid man. These were medical soldiers assigned to infantry companies and went with the infantry right into frontline combat. The next degree, or the next division, was called the Battalion Aid Station, which was situated several hundred yards behind the front line, and it was to the aid station that the litter bearers would bring the wounded for their first treatment after the first aid man literally gave first aid. The company aid man, that's all he could do. The third division, or unit, was called the collecting station. And the collecting station might have been about, several miles behind the front line, and it had a lot more personnel. The aid station would maybe have 1 doctor or 1 officer, although by the time I got there, they didn't have MDs, they had what we called Medical Administrative Corps, MACs, who went through, they were 90-day wonders. 90 days, and they got their commission, and they were officers. They didn't know any more than I did. So we didn't have any doctors. We had 1 officer and 2 or 3 technicians in the aid station. In the collecting station, there would be a lot more personnel, but the 4th degree was several miles back, and that was the clearing station. And the clearing station was almost like a mini hospital. There were doctors, there might even be a dentist, several nurses, a chaplain or 2. They could do surgery, they could set up x-ray machines. The clearing station was the forerunner in World War II of MASH in the Korean War. Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, MASH. When I was finally gotten my first assignment by the battalion, I was assigned to the aid station. But occasionally, I was moved forward to an infantry company, usually with the 358th Regiment. Sometimes I was a litter bearer. In combat, everybody carries litters. I mean, you could be a captain or a major or a light colonel, and if you were on the line and wounded need to be evacuated, you picked up a litter and you carried them back. The overall remembrance I have of that winter of 44, 45 was, will I ever be warm and dry again? It was cold, it was snowing, freezing rain. You were always wet, always cold. The quartermaster would send up every day, if they could get through, dry socks. The problem was, as soon as you took off your wet socks, put the dry ones on, within 2 or 3 hours, they were just as wet as the ones you took off. We treated more cases of frostbite of the feet. They would also bring up K-rations, cigarettes, when they could get through. It was the most miserable winter I ever spent. You could never really get warm. And you were always cold, and you were always scared. People ask you, are you scared? Yes, you're scared. You're always scared. But you do what you have to do, even though you're scared. Bravery doesn't mean not being afraid. Bravery means trying to do your job even when you're scared spitless. And there were times when all of us were that way, especially after we'd get pulled back for a while, and then we'd get the word, as I said a little while ago, leave your blanket at the CP, the command post, we're moving out. And then these feelings would churn up inside of you again. Am I going to make it this time? There are 4 specific incidents that occurred during my 4.5 months of actual combat that are forever burned in my memory, and I want to share each of those with you now. In January of 1945, somewhere in Luxembourg, I don't know the name of the town, can't remember, we had set up the aid station in a barn. It was at least dry, and we could build a bit of a fire in a little potbelly stove to keep warm. We set up the aid station. You always carried, the ambulances would carry these medical chests. The chest here and the chest there, and then a litter, a stretcher, would be stretched across the 2 chests, and that was our sort of operating table. I remember I was working that station. There was another aid man or another technician with me, and we had no officer. No, there were 2 others, but no officer. We had a staff sergeant and myself and a T5, a technician, 5th grade. The litter bearers brought in, well, they kept bringing in wounded, but the litter bearers brought in this particular GI, set up the stretcher on the medical chests, and I was the one, the other guys were busy, so I had to go see what the problem was. And this guy had a big gaping abdominal wound. That's why when I saw Saving Private Ryan, when the death of that medic, that was a similar kind of wound that he had. So you get out, we had plasma. That was another wonderful thing about the World War II medicine. We had plasma, we had morphine syrettes to ease the pain, and we had these big compresses, surgical compresses. So I immediately tried to, the first thing you do, treat for shock, keep them warm, and stop the bleeding. So I called over one of the other technicians because I knew I couldn't do it all by myself. We would have to lift the guy a little bit to get some of his clothing off him. You have to cut the uniform off to expose the wound. Well, while we're working on him, and I was on the, would have been his left side. I remember my left arm was sort of under his shoulder. He said, "I want to pray." Well, I looked at his dog tags, and I saw there in the lower right-hand corner the letter H, Hebrew. Then I looked at his name, and it was a Jewish name. And this Jewish boy was asking a Christian boy to pray with him. I didn't know any Jewish prayers. But then it suddenly hit me, yes, I do. I know one Jewish prayer. So I put my arm under his shoulders, and I bent down very close to his mouth, and I began to say, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." That was prayed by a Jew for the first time. The wonderful thing about it was, he began to say it with me, and he died in my arms. He never finished. A lot of guys, the old saying, there are no atheists in foxholes, there's a lot of truth to that. You'd hear the wounded calling for two people, God and mother. Not necessarily in that order either. So many men, in extremis, were looking for a God they really never knew. Well, that was the first situation, when that Jewish GI died in my arms in that barn somewhere in Luxembourg. The next incident I remember vividly was the Rhine River crossing, a little later on. This would have been late March. My unit crossed the Rhine at Mainz, and the bridges had been blown. The German Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, that was the last time we really ever saw any German planes. I mean, the Rhine, to Hitler and the Germans, the Rhine was the last barrier. They had to keep the enemy, us, from crossing the Rhine into the heart of the fatherland. So they threw everything at us, everything they had, which wasn't very much. But the Luftwaffe did have some planes that strafed and bombed. And the Corps of Engineers, God bless them, kept putting up pontoon bridges. Some guys crossed in amphibious vehicles. But I was riding in a Jeep. Why I was riding in a Jeep and not in a 2.5-ton truck or an ambulance, I don't remember to this day. All I remember was I was sitting in the back of a Jeep. There were 4 of us in the Jeep. The driver, one guy in the front, and 2 of us in the back, crossing over on one of these pontoon bridges that the Corps of Engineers had built across the river. And, you know, the German mortar people are on the other side in the trees. The German mortarmen were very good. The GIs used to say, the German mortarmen could put a mortar in your hip pocket. They really were good. So I'm scared stiff that we're going to get hit by either strafed by the Luftwaffe or bombed out by a mortar. Well, the Jeep didn't get hit, but the bridge got hit just as we got to the other side. And we all wound up in the water. 2 of the 4 of us were literally killed. I can't swim. To this day, I can't swim. You know, when you grow up in Brooklyn, you don't have swimming pools, and Coney Island was not a very nice place to go, and we didn't have swimming classes in high school or anything, so I didn't know how to swim. And I'm thinking, my God, I'm going to drown. But I spitting water out. I managed to crawl ashore, and I'm looking back, and there's these two of my buddies are lying there dead. Nothing I could do for them. And I said, Lord, you spared my life. Thank you. Why, I don't know. But as a matter of fact, all during those 4.5 months, I never got a scratch. I don't have a Purple Heart. I managed to survive. The third incident that I recall so well, and I think I may have mentioned this the last time I was talking to this group, so if I'm repeating myself to some of you, I apologize. The third incident was in the German city of Hof, H-O-F, which is in southeastern Germany, not far from the Czechoslovakian border. This was a fair-sized city, and the Germans were really dug into Hof. There was a lot of street fighting. The GIs had to clear the city block by block, almost house by house. And at this point, I was in a forward unit with a company. I and one other medic, Smitty. I'll never forget little Smitty. Smith was his last. I don't remember his first name, but we always called him Smitty. And I can remember a firefight in what looked to be like the town square. A lot of cobblestones, buildings all around, some of them bombed out, but the Germans are up in the windows of these buildings. The GIs are walking along, huddled in doorways, and there are wounded out in the square. American wounded and German wounded. I said to the platoon leader, the lieutenant, I said, sir, somehow we got to get to these guys and take care of these. You're crazy, Doc. How the hell are you going to go out there? They're going to be shooting at you. I said, can you find something like a sheet or a pillowcase or something in the, wave a white flag. Well, somebody did come up with a white flag. I don't know what it was, a pillowcase, a sheet, a woman's blouse, I don't know what it was. But anyway, they stick it on the end of a bayonet and the rifle, and they're waving this white flag. And the Germans see it, the American GIs see it, and I said to Smitty, let's go. So we start, not on our stomachs, but certainly not standing up. Like that crazy commercial on TV about the guy in the store looking at the breakfast cereal down on the lower shelf. Well, that's the way we were walking, like that. Miraculously, all the shooting stopped. We got out there to where the wounded lay, and from the other side of the street comes a German medic. And the German medics were very easy to spot, better than, you could spot them better than you could spot Americans, because the Germans had a bib, front and back. All we had were armbands, which sometimes got pretty dirty in the mud, and the helmets got dirty. But the Germans had, like a sandwich man, they had a big red cross in the front and a big red cross in the back. You could easily spot the German medics. And of course, as you know, under the Geneva Convention, medical personnel are not allowed to carry weapons. I never fired a gun the whole time I was in the Army. In the Pacific, however, the medics did, because the Japanese did not observe the Geneva Convention. The Germans, for the most part, did, but the Japanese never did. And so the medics in the Pacific, I think, were armed with carbines and sidearms, 45s. Anyway, we go creeping out there, and the German medic comes, and the poor guy doesn't have anything in the way of equipment. So Smitty and I are sharing with the German medic what we have. to take care of his guys and our guys, and then I beckoned to some of the guys in the infantry men, come help us carry these guys back, get them out of here. And the Germans did the same thing. We cleared the area. But I will never forget that, because I kept hearing the words, love your enemy. Well, I didn't exactly love this guy, but I was doing for him something which he couldn't do for himself. I was taking care of a person who an hour before was trying to kill me, as it were. That left a lasting impression on me. I had treated German prisoners of war in the hospital in the States before I went overseas, because they did send a lot of German POWs back to this country, and when they get sick, they go to the hospital. Well, that was somewhat different, treating a German prisoner of war in a hospital in the United States than treating him on the battlefield in his own country. So I shall never forget that. The fourth and final thing that I recall so vividly, among many, many others, but the thing that left a real lasting impression was moving on from Hof a little further, closer to the Czech border now, of one of the German concentration camps. It wasn't as well known as Dachau or the other ones, but Flossenburg was a German concentration camp. And for the first time, those of us who stumbled upon it saw what the Holocaust really was all about. They set in, and I was part of a team of medical personnel that was sent in. Division headquarters ordered the 315th Medical Battalion to put together a medical team to go in and see what we could do for these people. The pictures you've seen of prisoners, the Jewish prisoners in concentration camps, it's just like that. The thing that impresses you most is you see the ribs sticking out, they're so skinny, and the eyes in their heads. We saw dead bodies stacked like cordwood outside the ovens, the furnaces, and the furnaces were still warm. The camp, as all German concentration camps were run by the SS, the Schutzstaffel, the Germans' so-called elite guard, the SS, and they wore black uniforms, and they had what looked like two lightning bolts on their shoulder. That was the SS, the most feared part of the German army. The Wehrmacht, the other aspect of the German army, were GIs, just like we were, you know. But the SS were the elite troops. Well, they had fled. They knew the Americans were on the way, and they ran, and they left all what was left. I learned later there were maybe 1,000 still alive in that camp. Well, we go in there. There wasn't much we could do. We were supposed to take care of any that needed immediate treatment for anything. We also brought in a bunch of DDT with us to try to clean them up. DDT is illegal now, but we used a lot of DDT in the water, you know, to kill the bugs. And I was always impressed by the silence. I don't think they really knew. They were still afraid. They saw the uniforms. They didn't know whether we were Americans or not, because we had to reassure them as soon as we got in there, and that you know, we were there to help, not to hurt them. And they would try to smile, try to talk, but it was the most pathetic experience. It was really a very shocking experience to see them. Later on, I understand we had to move on. The division had to move on, but they were all liberated and taken back and put in tents where they were given further medical treatment, and they tried to find out where they lived, and they were part of the vast number of DPs, displaced persons, that were all over Europe at the end of World War II. But another thing about Flossenbürg, I don't know whether any of you have ever heard the name Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German Lutheran pastor who had taught here in the United States at Union Seminary in New York, went back to Germany. When he could have stayed secure here in the United States, he went back to Germany in the 30s. He was part of the group that plotted against Hitler, the overthrow of Hitler. He was found out and sent to the Flossenbürg concentration camp. And about 2 weeks before we liberated that camp, early in April of 1945, the SS hanged Dietrich Bonhoeffer in the Flossenbürg camp. I didn't find this out until years later. If anybody had talked to me about Bonhoeffer at that time, I wouldn't have known who they were talking about. But to think that if we had been there only 2 weeks earlier, we might have saved him. So, if anybody ever tells you that the Holocaust didn't happen, that Hitler didn't kill 6 million Jews, tell them they don't know what they're talking about, because I have seen some of that. The war ended in May of 1945, May the 9th. At that time, I was in Czechoslovakia with my unit. There was a big pincer movement. The Russians were moving from the east, driving west, and the Americans and French and British were driving east. And we were to meet right to crush the Germans and squeeze them out. Well, we met in Czechoslovakia. We met a Russian unit coming from the east, and here we were moving eastward. The thing I remember so vividly about that encounter, and it only lasted about a day or two, was seeing that Russian column moving down the road, and there were armored vehicles. There were, like we had, half-tracks and jeeps or the equivalent. And in the middle, sandwiched in periodically, of this very mechanized column were ox-drawn carts. That was the laundry detail. There were women driving ox-drawn carts. Well, whether they were there to do the laundry or other things, I don't know. But I could not imagine. It seemed so incongruous to see this modern mechanized equipment cheek by jowl with this primitive ox-drawn two-wheeled carts. Well, everybody was Amerikanische, Tovarisch, and we were all buddy-buddy. It was there that I had my first taste of vodka. The Russians always carried vodka. We never had any booze with us. If we could liberate some bottles of wine in a German cellar, we were doing well. So you have to, they drink it like water. And oh my God, I thought I would die. From that day to this, I can't drink vodka. Gin, yes, but not vodka. And we were trading things. The guys would trade Mickey Mouse watches or whatever, and everybody was friendly. But then we had to pull back. And we became part of the Army of Occupation. Back across the border, right into southeastern Germany. It was at that time that I got my combat medic's badge. And I knew then that the medics was what I should have been. I was more proud of that than I was almost anything else to get that. But we were going to be Army of Occupation for a while. We didn't know how long we'd have to be there because we were told that the war in Europe, in Asia was still going on in the Pacific. And we had rumors that we were going to be sent back to the United States, retrained, and then put on ships out of San Francisco or Seattle to go to the Pacific to invade Japan. But in the meantime, two different experiences I had during that Army of Occupation period that turned out for me to be tests of my future vocation. The first one was teaching. The Army discovered that a lot of the late draftees, guys drafted near the end of the war from rural parts of America, were illiterate. They could neither read nor write. And the Army wanted to teach them how to read and write. How I got picked, I and a sergeant named Herbert Durr, D-E-R-R. In our unit, we were commissioned to be the school teachers of some 30 or 40 GIs who could not read or write. Our classroom in the town of Weiden, about 30 miles from where the little village where my unit was stationed, the school room was a Board of Health clinic, a German health clinic. I mean, there were blackboards there, and there were chairs and tables. So every morning, we got picked up and driven to Weiden to teach these 30 GIs. I agreed with Herb. I said, Herb, English, arithmetic was not my strength in school. I was no good at arithmetic. I said, you teach arithmetic, I'll teach reading and writing. Okay. So from 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, with a break for lunch, we taught these guys. And we were told, you've got 6 weeks to teach them how to, the goal you ought to achieve is they should be able to write a letter home and to read a little bit of the Stars and Stripes, the Army newspaper. Would you believe, I had never had any pedagogical training, although when I entered Brooklyn College, I had a vague idea of going on to be an English teacher because I was good in English in high school. Anyway, I started out teaching them the alphabet. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I had the guy singing it. These big GIs singing A, B, C, D. We laughed about it. I'd write it all on the board, and then how do you pronounce A, B, K, D? You know, phonetics. I taught them phonetics. And then I would read to them. I would read from the Stars and Stripes, because all of us were interested in the war in the Pacific. So we'd read about Guadalcanal, and we read about all the battles that were going on over there. So I taught them how to read, how to do phonetics, penmanship, while Herb in the afternoon taught them arithmetic. They did. We accomplished our mission. And I read the letters, crudely printed, grammatically incorrect in many instances, but they wrote home, and they were so proud. I can remember one guy said, why the hell do I have to learn all this stuff? He was from some place in, I think it was North Carolina, if you'll pardon the expression, out of the tobacco farm or something down there. I said, well, you got to go into business. You got to learn how to keep books. You've got to learn how to write letters in business. You'll find it very helpful Anyway, when we were all through, a big graduation, they were so proud that they could do this. And we hugged each other. Oh, we also, for diversion during the lunch hour, we played poker. I love poker. And I still like to play poker. So we play poker. And then we go back to A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And that was, I learned that I did have a gift of communication, at least in teaching. So that was one thing. The second incident, during that occupation time, the Army was getting smart. You know, my son graduated from West Point, and he was a military intelligence officer. Well, I always told him military intelligence, that's an oxymoron. But, excuse me, listen. They said, there is a lot of talent in the Army that we don't know about. So they sent over what they called CATS, C-A-T-S, stood for Civilian Actress Technicians. And two CATs were assigned to our division, the 90th Division. Their mission, to put together a show. And they held auditions. And I auditioned, and I got a part. What it was not a musical with a plot to speak of. It was more of a variety show. Song and dance and comedy. But I got a job with a part in the show. And we named it, the show was called Script and Score. Script and Score. And we toured all of the division, and then we went on the road and toured another neighboring division. I sang You Belong to My Heart, was the song, was my big number. I also led a group of 8 guys singing a cappella the Whiffenpoof song, to the tables down at Maury's, to the place where Louis dwells, and I'm directing these. And they sent back to Paris, the division sent back to Paris to get costumes for us, civilian clothes. None of us had worn civilian clothes for 4 years. It was like GI boot. We had to learn to do a 2-step in GI boots. The girls were teaching us. Finally, we got dance shoes from Paris. Made it a hell of a lot easier to do a little 2-step. So I toured the some of southern Germany with Script and Score. I forget how many performances. We played every night. And we got good reviews in the division newspaper and the Stars and Stripes. What my mother did with all that stuff I sent home. Anyway, that was a wonderful experience. But finally, and I'm going to bring this to a close in a little bit here, but finally, I was redeployed. I had enough points to be sent home. And so I sailed out of Le Havre for New York sometime in February, or late February, early March of 1945. And I was sent home on a Liberty ship. Now, the Liberty ships, I think Todd Shipyards built Liberty ships right here in Seattle. I mean, they were really tubs, put together in a big fat hurry, and not very sturdy. And to sail the North Atlantic in March or February is no picnic. And again, remember, I don't swim. And I can see to this day, when we'd go in the trough of a wave, and I'd look up and all I could see was a wall of water. Then when we hit the crest of the wave, all I could see was sky and no water at all. And then the ship at one point began to list. And the captain ordered all personnel on the other side to right the darn thing. And I thought, oh God, all that I've been through, I'm going to drown in the North Atlantic before I ever get home. I didn't. I'm here tonight. Anyway, that was an interesting experience. Oh, I do remember another thing on that ship. The cook served pork chops And I love pork chops. And a lot of the guys were seasick as the devil. And I ate all the pork chops. I would sit in that, and they would look at me and they'd get green and they'd get sick of just looking at me eat their pork chops. You know how old I was? I was 20 years old, 21? Yeah. Finally, I was discharged in March of '46. My war experiences were over, but not my life experience. My journey wasn't over quite yet. I do have 2 souvenirs of my war experience as a medic that I'd like to show you. They ain't very big. My bandage scissors. I carry them on a little holder on my cartridge belt. I mean, the GIs had knives and hand grenades and stuff hanging off there. I had my little scissors to cut off uniforms and everything. So that's one thing. But the other thing, my combat medic's badge. I still have it. I still have my uniform, which doesn't fit me at all anymore. But the paratroopers had their badge. The infantry had their combat infantry badge. And finally, they issued a badge to the combat medics. This was worth $10 a month extra on your paycheck. You want to pass it around? I need it back. I've had that thing for 55 years. I don't want to lose it now. Anyway, within 2 weeks after I got home to Brooklyn, I got a letter from a producer of a Broadway show called Call Me Mister. It was a musical about the transition of all these GIs back to civilian life. Call Me Mister. I mean, it didn't make the big time like South Pacific, but it was a reasonably good show. This producer was putting together a road company to go on tour. And I was offered a job to sing in the chorus, the boy chorus of Call Me Mister. It seems that somebody had witnessed one of my performances in script and score, somebody who had been a talent scout in civilian life. And when he got out of the Army, he had checked up on names. He had a whole list of names of people. And I was offered a job to sing in the chorus, no audition required. Now, you know, that was really quite an opportunity if I really wanted to break into show business. Thank you. Now I really had to make a decision. Remember, I still had 2.5 years of college left. Well, when I entered Brooklyn College in '41, as I said, I thought I might major in English and get my BA in English, and then go on to Columbia Teachers College for a master's and teach high school English in the city of New York, because you had to have an MA, a master's degree, to teach at the high school level in New York. But my war experience showed me that I had other gifts. So what should I do? Should I go into teaching? Should I try for showbiz? I mean, here, this opportunity was presented to me on a silver platter. And what about the ordained ministry as a third possibility? I had always been close to the church, always said my prayers, and what to do? And the words of Sam Benson came back to me. Look at all the things you experienced and ask, what's God saying to me in all of this? I didn't know it at the time, but what I was really doing was a little theology. I was reflecting on the history of my life to see how God was trying to reveal himself to me. This is what the Hebrews did. This is how the Old Testament got to be written. The Jews looked back on their experiences from Abraham through the Exodus and all that. And they said, this is what our God is doing for us. So, I look back on my experiences. Show business. Should I really accept this offer? Well, that I rejected right away because I really did want to go back to school. And this guy wanted an answer, you know, like right now. And I didn't know if I did this, whether I'd ever get back to college. And besides, show business is so unpredictable. I really wasn't all that good. And if you really want to make any money in show business, you have to be pretty good. Teaching. I think in my ABC boys over in that first aid clinic in Weiden that I could teach. I had somewhat of a gift for that. But I thought to myself, I've seen some of the world now. I've been halfway around the United States, halfway to Europe. I don't want to spend the rest of my life in Brooklyn, New York. So that experience as a medic pointed me in the direction of the ordained ministry. I hadn't wanted to be one, but that's what I was given. I ministered constantly to the sick, to the dying. I saw men in extremis seeking a God that many of them didn't even know. I came through the war unscathed. My life was spared for what? And the fact that I was always close to the church. So I sort of became convinced. I didn't get any bolt out of the blue. I didn't have any angels standing around saying, fear not. I got the feeling that God might be calling me to the priesthood. So in the fall of 1946, I did two things. I went to see my rector to start the process toward ordination, and I returned to school to finish my college education. I have been in the ordained ministry for almost 48 years. And you know what? In all those years, and right up to this day, I have not really given up either being a teacher or being in show business. I'm still teaching, more so now than I ever did during my years as active bishop. And every time I put on vestments and walk in procession down the center aisle on a Sunday morning, I'm in show business. The modern theater was born in the church, and good liturgy is good theater. The priests in this diocese who do liturgy best are also people who have had some theater experience. So, my young friends, I have lived now for almost 3/4 of a century. This summer, I'll be 75 years old. So now in the evening of my life, I can look back on it with profound thanks to God for the many, many blessings that I've received. Loving parents, a faithful and devoted wife of 48 years, 2 fine sons, of whom I am very, very proud, many wonderful friends, and most of all, a vocation which has enriched me beyond measure. Praise the Lord. Thank you.
Thank you.
See, it's just an out, right?
Yep.
I,
Do you have time for a few questions?
Yeah, sure.
Any other questions? They want to ask something?
Those are the same scissors that you used.
what?
Are those the same scissors?
Yes, they are. Oh, I had these in Germany. That's the only thing I managed to save, apart from the badge on the uniform.
So those are the same scissors that cut away bloodied uniforms?
Yes, and you can see the little knob here. So when you put it under a piece of clothing, it wouldn't stick the guy. Oh yeah, no, I used these, and they were right on, and they were easily accessible, you know, on my belt. So if I needed, I didn't have to dig into my pouch. I could just rip it out and cut away.
Adult scissors could talk.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Was there ever a time in that journey in
Yeah.
World War II
Mm-hmm.
where you felt desperate or dark, or where is God?
Well, yeah, literally dark. I remember an experience I didn't relate was in January of that same 1945 rather, on night patrol with a combat patrol, and I was assigned as the medic, and we got lost, and in the woods, in the Thuringian forest, and it was pitch black, and I didn't know where my unit was. Well, I could hear noises all around me. I didn't know whether they were GIs or whether they were Germans, and I was scared, and I didn't know, this is the end. I don't know where I was, and finally, I stayed there all night long, and then when at first light, I could look around, and sure enough, I was with among friends. But yeah, I was scared, and if you mean, were there ever any times when I wondered what I should do with my life during the war?
Where was God in that space? Did you ever feel abandoned?
I prayed. No. Oh no, God was always there, but even so, you're still scared, and you wonder whether it really is going to, praying is really going to help. Oh sure.
I think, Mary, you meant more like the deep, dark despair of the soul, like, what am I doing here all alone?
Well, yeah, that was being alone in the dark in quote, enemy territory is a very terrifying experience. It really, really is. I remember I talked about this once at a Feast of Lights when I was back in Salt Lake City. We had a big Feast of Lights at Epiphany. You don't know what darkness really is and how wonderful light is until you see it, and then you know the people near you are your buddies and not not the German Wehrmacht.
Any other questions?
Actually, I've got two. First one is, during the time that you were actually out in the battlefield, was there ever a time that you just kind of, said to yourself, this is it, I'm not going to make it? And how did you maintain an attitude where you kept on just moving to say, I'm going to get out of here?
You don't think. You don't sit back and meditate on the thing. You move. You have to act. You have to be constantly doing something. You don't have time to think. I did see GIs freeze in fear. And you give them a boot and a fanny and say, come on, move out, let's go. The secret is to keep moving and to do what you were trained to do. And you don't think about what's going to happen if. That's deadly. You simply have to, you're scared, as I said, yes, but you don't stop doing what you're trained to do.